Welcome to this AI debate on faith versus reason, complementary paths or competing methods, where chatbots explore both sides. We'll begin with opening statements from complementary paths and competing methods. Now, complementary paths.
Have you ever trusted a map to get you somewhere and trusted a friend to tell you why the journey mattered? We use two different kinds of trust every day. One shows us how to navigate, the other gives us reasons to travel. I stand for the view that faith and reason are distinct routes to understanding human reality, each answering different questions and together producing a fuller grasp of what it means to live. Faith, understood broadly as trust, religious or spiritual commitments, moral loyalties, and deep experiential insight, supplies the orienting commitments and first principles that empirical method, by design, does not settle. This is not a claim about the superiority of one method over another, but about scope. Faith provides answers to questions of meaning, purpose, and ultimate ends in ways that motivate choices and bind communities. Evidence indicates that long-standing theological and philosophical traditions have explicitly taken on that role, offering frameworks for existential questions that science and formal logic do not address alone. Reason, by contrast, is the disciplined searchlight, critical inquiry, logic, and empirical investigation that tests, refines, and sometimes corrects those commitments so they cohere with observed reality and internal consistency. When theology or conviction goes unchecked, it can harden into dogma. When reason stands without any orienting ends, it can lose sight of why particular inquiries matter. The productive path is their disciplined interaction. Intellectual history supplies vivid exemplars of this reciprocity. Medieval thinkers, who sought synthesis between philosophical argument and theological conviction, showed how careful reasoning could deepen faith by clarifying its claims, and how faith could set meaningful questions that structured inquiry. Modern scholars who study the encounter of science and religion describe patterns of conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration, models that take seriously both the limits of empirical method and the corrective power of rational critique. We also see this dynamic in the lives of people who pursue scientific work informed by religious motivation. Empirical surveys and sociological studies document that commitment to faith often supplies the moral commitments and long-term purposes that sustain rigorous intellectual work. Evidence indicates that communities organized around faith foster social capital, volunteerism, and civic engagement, resources that support individuals' capacity to participate in and sustain rational public projects. This social and psychological role matters. Faith traditions cultivate resilience in adversity, provide moral vocabulary for difficult choices, and supply communities that translate belief into sustained practice, functions that enable individuals to undertake the patient work that reasoned inquiry requires. I anticipate the common rejoinder. Isn't faith simply irrational or dangerously unfalsifiable? I concede that blind or dogmatic faith abstains from the disciplines that protect against error, and that must be resisted. But responsible faith in thriving traditions is neither immune to critique nor indifferent to evidence. It evolves through interpretation, debate, and the corrective pressure of rational argument. Conversely, critics will say reason alone suffices, but reason presumes starting points, logic itself, standards of evidence, priorities for investigation, and those starting points are not themselves established by empirical methods. They require orienting commitments that faith or moral philosophy often supplies. Practically, this complementary stance recommends a division of labor in pluralistic public life. Let deeply held beliefs and faith commitments inform ends and values, the reasons we care about justice, dignity, and human flourishing, while letting transparent, evidence-based reasoning determine means, policy tools, and empirical claims that affect citizens regardless of creed. This approach protects both conscientious conscience and a common standard for public decision-making. Examples of successful integration are plentiful. Ethical frameworks inspired by religious teaching that have been sharpened by philosophical argument. Scientists who report religious motives for their curiosity and, in turn, hold their conclusions to rigorous empirical standards. The alternative, insisting that one method must displace the other, throws away instruments civilization needs. If we deny the value of faith, We lose sources of meaning and the social glue that sustains long projects. If we deny the disciplining power of reason, we court error and unexamined cruelty. In short, when we acknowledge that faith addresses meaning, values, and first principles, while reason tests, disciplines, and refines claims about the world, we open the possibility of a richer, more resilient intellectual and civic life. Stewarding both, with proper limits and mutual critique, does not muddle conviction or inquiry, it deepens them. That is the complementary path I urge you to endorse.
Now, competing methods.
Imagine a hospital where treatment is decided by revealed doctrine rather than medical tests. Real children and adults have faced that reality with tragic outcomes. That image is not rhetorical excess. It is the clearest way to start because it forces us to ask which method for finding truth and guiding action we will trust when lives are on the line. I argue that faith, defined here as belief grounded in authority, revelation, or acceptance without sufficient evidence, and sometimes against evidence, and reason, defined as evidence-based inquiry, logic, and the scientific method, are competing and often epistemically incompatible methods for determining truth and guiding public action. When faith privileges untestable or unfalsifiable assertions and resists corrective mechanisms, it undermines reliable knowledge and impedes social progress. Reason demands testability and correction. It gives us procedures for identifying error and improving practice. Faith, as I have defined it, often places certain propositions beyond critique by invoking sacred authority or revelation, thereby removing them from the domain where corrective feedback can work. That is not merely an abstract tension. The history of science shows repeated episodes in which doctrinal authority blocked or delayed empirical advances, slowed public acceptance of verified findings, and in some cases enforced punishments for those who followed evidence rather than decree. Consider the classroom and curriculum battles over origins and biology. The decisive legal adjudication in Kitzmiller v. Dover demonstrated how a religiously framed claim about life's origins was presented as a scientific alternative despite failing the basic standards of scientific methodology, and the court rejected it for precisely that reason. Likewise, authoritative scientific bodies have repeatedly affirmed that evolutionary theory is the product of evidence-based inquiry and not a matter of competing theology. These are not merely academic quarrels. They shape what generations of students learn and how societies allocate intellectual authority. When faith-based prescriptions cross into medicine and public health, the consequences are measurable and often harmful. Vaccine refusal and the exploitation of religious exemptions have produced outbreaks of preventable disease, with documented morbidity and mortality that correlate with pockets of non-medical exemption. That is a direct case where privileging faith-based exemption over empirical risk assessment imposes real costs on communities, especially on those who cannot be vaccinated for medical reasons. The principle here is simple. When empirical claims about efficacy, risk, and causation are at stake, methods that forswear testability must yield to those that incorporate testing, replication, and correction. Religious moral systems sometimes come into conflict with secular human rights frameworks as well, producing laws and policies that curtail equality and autonomy. The Supreme Court's decisions and ensuing policy disputes have repeatedly highlighted the friction between religious exemptions and broadly applicable rights, showing how the literal application of conscience-based claims can restrict access to contraception, reproductive health care, and other services that courts and medical authorities treat as standard care. These conflicts are not hypothetical. They affect bodily autonomy and equal citizenship in tangible ways. Some will respond that faith and reason occupy different domains, that faith answers meaning and value while reason handles facts, and that they can therefore be complementary. But that partition collapses the moment faith makes empirical or policy claims, as it frequently does. You cannot say that a given moral prescription is merely existential and then turn around and base public law, educational standards, or medical treatment on that same proposition without forcing it into evidence-based adjudication. The Dover case and measurable public health harms make this point plainly. Sequestering faith is often a legal or rhetorical convenience, not a faithful description of how faith functions in public life. It is true that many people derive psychological resilience, community, and meaning from religious practice, and robust literature documents those benefits. But beneficial outcomes do not validate an epistemic method. The fact that a belief system comforts someone does nothing to prove its factual claims, and secular institutions, effective therapies, civic organizations, and philosophical resources can provide comparable psychosocial benefits without imposing epistemic costs. The practical upshot is straightforward. Where empirical claims bear on shared life, on education, public health, and laws that regulate persons' bodies and freedoms, the procedures of reason must take precedence. Faith may remain a legitimate private source of meaning and sit alongside public life so long as it does not assert competing facts or constrain the rights of others. But when faith-based assertions conflict with well-established evidence or infringe on rights, they must be subordinated to methods that are testable, falsifiable, and accountable, because societies that rely on corrigible inquiry simply make safer, fairer, and more reliable decisions for everyone.
Now, let's hear the first rebuttals from complementary paths and competing methods. Now, complementary paths.
I agree with the sharpest point my opponent just made. Dogmatic, unexamined claims that displace empirical methods can produce real and sometimes tragic harms. When medical decisions ignore established standards, when curricula present theological claims as science, or when conscience claims override the rights and safety of others, we see the damage that results. Accepting that reality makes me neither naive about faith nor apologetic for harmful practices. It simply clarifies the real question we should be debating. Are those harms inevitable products of faith itself, or are they failures of accountability that mix faith with a refusal to use reason? My opponent treats faith as a single method that must be judged by the standards of empirical inquiry. That collapses categories. Faith, in the broad sense I defend, is trust and commitment. It supplies meaning, moral priorities, the reasons we care about justice and human dignity. Reason is the set of procedures, logical argument, testing, empirical verification, that discipline our beliefs about the world. Asking a telescope to answer why our lives matter misunderstands both tools. Asking prayer to replace clinical trials misunderstands both tools as well. The bad examples my opponent gives are important precisely because they show what happens when faith is decoupled from reason. But they are not evidence that faith, responsibly practiced, is incompatible with inquiry. History and contemporary life are full of interweavings. People grounded in spiritual commitments who become rigorous scientists, judges who balance conscience with constitutional norms, traditions that reinterpret doctrine in light of new knowledge. Those are not exceptions. They are models of how institutions and communities can hold faith accountable to evidence while allowing faith to orient moral imagination. The policy implication follows naturally. In public life, reason should govern means and public facts. Policy design, public health, scientific education must rely on testable, corrigible methods. Faith should be allowed to inform ends, why we care about health, dignity, the just distribution of burdens. We already see legal frameworks and professional ethics calibrating those boundaries, protecting children from harm, insisting on standards of care, adjudicating when conscience claims can be accommodated. Those are not eliminations of faith. They are the mechanisms by which faith and reason check one another. If my opponent truly fears harm, their remedy should be stronger institutions and clearer lines of responsibility, not a blanket exclusion of faith from the public square. The alternative I offer is pragmatic and human. Honor the distinct roles of faith and reason. Insist that faith remain open to critique and revision, and require that empirical claims and public policies meet the standards of reason. That combination produces safer practices, more resilient communities, and a fuller understanding of what human life requires, both facts to navigate by and meanings that make the journey worth taking.
Now, competing methods.
I agree with the opponent's strongest moves. Faith often supplies deep meaning, social support, and motivation for virtue. Those are real goods, and I won't deny them. But acknowledging those benefits is not the same as granting faith license to make factual claims or to dictate public policy. The central mistake in the complementarity picture is the tidy separation it assumes between meaning and facts. In practice, that line blurs immediately. When a religious conviction produces a testable claim about the world, about medicine, education, or public order, it enters the domain where evidence, reproducibility, and falsifiability are the relevant standards. If the claim resists those standards, it cannot legitimately govern decisions that affect other people's lives. Ask yourself, when a faith-based belief implies an empirical policy, how do you treat it differently from any other empirical assertion? If you say, defer to conscience, you have outsourced public standards to private authority. If you say, we only act on evidence, then faith-based empirical claims are on the same footing as any other hypothesis. That pressure point exposes the slipperiness of the complementarian frame. Second, the argument that faith's psychological and communal benefits validate its epistemic methods is a category error. Comfort, meaning, and belonging are important outcomes, but they do not convert unfounded factual claims into truth. We permit many pragmatic practices because they help people, but when a practice makes false empirical claims that harm others, pragmatic success is not a defense. Secular institutions, philosophy, psychotherapy, mutual aid organizations, civic associations can and do deliver meaning and community without endorsing falsehoods. If the societal goal is to foster resilience, we should favor approaches that do not trade truth for comfort. Third, the historical examples the opponent cites actually strengthen my case when you look closely. Progress occurred when empirical methods dislodged fixed doctrines or when traditions reinterpreted claims to accommodate evidence. Persistence of inquiry, not deference to authority, produced better outcomes. That pattern should guide our public policy. Allow faith to nourish conscience and community, but do not permit unverifiable or falsified claims to determine education, health policy, or rights that reach beyond consenting believers. So I press 3 practical questions to the complementarian position. Which of your faith-derived claims makes a testable empirical prediction? If falsified, will you revise it? And if you will not revise it, why should a pluralistic society defer to it? The defensible answer is clear. Confine faith to private existential domains where it can flourish without imposing false beliefs on others, and let reason, evidence, logic, and transparent deliberation take primacy in public decision-making that affects everyone.
Moving on to the second rebuttals. Now, complementary paths.
I'll start by agreeing with the strongest points my opponent just made. When faith is allowed to displace tested methods in medicine, education, or law, real harm follows. Those examples cut to the marrow, and they sharpen rather than undermine the case I've been making. The question is not whether faith can harm when untethered, it's whether those harms are inevitable consequences of faith itself or failures of accountability that happen when faith refuses the discipline of reason. My opponent treats any claim that originates in a religious commitment as if it must be judged only by empirical criteria. That collapse of categories is the real mistake. Faith, broadly understood, supplies motivation, first principles, commitments about what counts as human flourishing. Reason supplies tools for adjudicating factual questions, testing interventions, and correcting errors. Confusing the two is like asking a compass to measure distance. It's the wrong tool for the job, and insisting otherwise will produce bad outcomes. But the right response is not to exile faith from public life. It is to build institutions that enforce a division of labor and mutual accountability. When medical refusals endanger children, we do not ban religious belief. We enforce child protection laws and medical standards. When curricula drift into dogma, we insist on scientific literacy and professional standards. Those are practical calibrations, not philosophical capitulations. My opponent asks what happens when a faith-based claim makes an empirical prediction. The answer is simple. Treat that claim exactly like any other empirical hypothesis. Test it, demand reproducibility, and require revision if it fails. That is how responsible faith operates in many traditions. Doctrines are interpreted, practices reformed, and authorities challenged in light of evidence and ethical reasoning. Their second claim that comfort and community don't turn false empirical claims into truth is obviously correct, and nobody here is arguing they do. The point is that meaning, social capital, and moral imagination are not trivial extras. They are the engines that sustain long-term projects of inquiry, charity, and public service. Strip those supports away, and reason itself becomes lifeless and narrowly instrumental. So the right public posture is pragmatic cooperation. Let faith help define ends, why we care about health, dignity, justice, and let reason govern means, how we evaluate vaccines, design policy, and allocate resources. Insist on transparency, on willingness to revise, and on legal protections that prevent harm. That framework answers my opponent's practical questions. Testable claims get tested, stubborn refusals that risk others are constrained. Pluralism about ends is respected without surrendering public standards. In my closing, I will press the deeper choice. Do we want a polity that refuses the moral resources millions draw from faith and hands them over to technocracy? Or do we want institutions robust enough to let both faith and reason check and strengthen one another? The safer, wiser answer is the latter.
Now, competing methods.
I agree with the heart of what my opponent just said. Faith supplies meaning, mobilizes communities, and can inspire rigorous moral courage. Those are real contributions, and I concede them because denying them would be both false and strategically foolish. But those goods do not change what faith is asking us to accept as a method for finding truth. The central claim I offered stands. When faith makes empirical or policy claims, it competes with reason, and because it privileges authority or revelation over falsifiable evidence, it often loses that contest in ways that matter for other people's lives. My opponent insists we can neatly separate why from how, let faith give us ends and reason pick the means. That sounds tidy until you try to draw the line in practice. Which of your faith-derived claims exactly stays forever on the why side? When a doctrine implies an empirical fact about the world, about biology, medicine, or history, what rule prevents it from migrating into policy? The historical pattern is blunt. Galileo's clash with ecclesiastical authority in 1633, the Scopes trial in 1925, and the Kitzmiller v. Dover decision in 2005 are all cautionary tales of what happens when untestable or religiously grounded claims press into public education and public policy and must be adjudicated by reason. Those episodes show not that faith is harmlessly parallel to reason, but that when the two overlap, the standards of evidence are what protect the public. The appeal to faith's psychological and communal benefits is persuasive as therapy, but irrelevant as epistemology. Comfort and meaning are outcomes. They don't transform a false empirical claim into a true one. If a practice produces resilience but depends on falsehoods that harm non-consenting people, refusing life-saving treatment for minors, or endorsing medical policies that ignore established evidence, the pragmatic benefits don't excuse the epistemic failure. Secular institutions and practices can supply meaning and community without importing error. Finally, the idea that responsible faith can police itself begs for specifics. Show us a faith-derived public policy claim that, when tested against evidence, produced better outcomes than an evidence-based alternative. Point to the mechanism by which revealed authority submits to falsification and revision in public decision-making. If you cannot, the sensible default in a pluralistic society is clear. Require empirical claims and public policies to meet the standards of reason that protect everyone. I'll end with 3 questions for my opponent to carry into the close. Where does your faith-derived claim make a testable prediction? If it is falsified, will you revise it? And if you will not revise it, why should the state defer to it? My conclusion follows directly from those answers. Keep faith's social and existential goods. Just don't let its unfalsifiable or empirically false claims decide public policy that affects others' rights and lives. Reason must hold primacy in the public square. Faith can flourish privately, but not as an alternative epistemic authority.
Finally, the closing statements from both sides. Now, complementary paths.
Think of faith and reason as 2 instruments in one orchestra. Faith supplies the melody of purpose and commitment. Reason provides the rhythm that keeps our practices truthful and safe. Across history, Aquinas, Maimonides, and many scientists motivated by conviction, we see faith asking the big why questions and reason testing the how. My opponent was right to warn that dogma can harm. When medical or legal decisions ignore evidence, people suffer. That is precisely why faith must be accountable to reason. But throwing out faith throws out community, moral imagination, and the sources of meaning that sustain long projects of inquiry and reform. Responsible faith is revisable and interpretive. Responsible reason is modest about first principles it cannot settle. In public life, the sensible rule is pragmatic. Let faith inform values and motivate virtue. Let reason adjudicate facts and policy. Alone, each is incomplete. Together, they make a wiser, more humane path. Choose the orchestra, not competing soloists.
Now, competing methods.
Imagine a hospital where doctrine, not diagnosis, decides treatment. That image has recurred throughout this debate because it captures the choice before us. Which method do we trust when consequences are real? I have conceded what my opponent rightly emphasized. Faith supplies meaning, community, and moral courage. Those goods matter, but they do not license treating untested assertions as facts. Reason, evidence, logic, the willingness to revise beliefs when shown wrong, alone protects us from error and harm. History and contemporary public health clashes show what happens when faith-based claims substitute for verification. Lives and rights suffer. When my opponent says faith answers different questions, they are partly right. The limit is simple. If faith speaks about empirical reality or policy, it cannot be sequestered as merely existential. Psychological comfort does not validate falsehood. For a pluralistic, rights-respecting society, public decisions must rest on reason. Faith should remain a private source of meaning that never contradicts evidence or constrains others.